first of all, to say thank you to Galin for agreeing to speak as part of this seminar series on world literature and translation. We've had a few sessions now, and we have a few more sessions coming up in the schedule. What I'll do is I'll post a link to the schedule in the chat as Galin is speaking, and you can have a look at any future sessions that you might be interested in attending. The idea with this seminar series in world literature and translation was to try and bring out the kinds of work that scholars in languages in particular, in language departments in particular, have been doing in world literature and translation. And obviously today, Galin, coming from Queen Mary's Department of Modern Languages, will speak perhaps more generally on the theme of world literature and theories of world literature. But that's the kind of thrust of the series that we've been putting together, and some of the other events in the series, as you'll see, reflect those questions a bit more explicitly. So Galin Tianov, I'm delighted to welcome Galin. He's the George Steiner Professor of Comparative Literature at Queen Mary University of London, and he has held visiting appointments at universities in Europe, North and South America, and Asia. And he's the author of 5 books, including most recently Death of Literary Theory, Regimes of Relevance in Russia and Beyond, and that came out with Stanford University Press in 2019. His research interests range from Russian, German, and Central European intellectual history to world literature, cultural theory, cosmopolitanism, and exile. He's elected member of the Academia Europaea, past president of the ICLA Committee on Literary Theory, and a member of the executive board of the Institute for World Literature at Harvard University. He's also an honorary scientific advisor to the Institute for Foreign Literatures, CAS, in Beijing, and he's currently completing a book called Cosmopolitanism, a very short introduction, and that's commissioned by Oxford University Press. Before I pass over to Galin, I just wanted to let everyone know that the chat is open, so you're very welcome to post comments and questions in the chat. I can then invite you during the Q&A to raise those questions yourself. You can alternatively raise your digital hand in Zoom, and I can invite you to put your question to Galin. We've got ample time this afternoon. We'll try to end the session by 5:30 at the latest. Galin will speak for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have about the same amount of time for questions again. So Galin's title today is Reflections on World Literature and the Resistance to Theory. I should just say that this session is being recorded, so if you don't wish to be recorded, you can turn off your video. Galin, I'm going to pass over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, and many thanks to you for the kind introduction, and to everyone at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of London for the invitation and for hosting this talk. I'm sorry we can't do this in person. My talk today consists of 2 parts, and these 2 parts reflect the ambivalent position of the discourse of world literature vis-a-vis literary theory. In the first part, I will try to explicate world literature's indebtedness to some of the basic premises of classic literary theory. And in the second part, I will take a look at the role of the discourse of world literature has been playing in attaining this salutary skepticism vis-a-vis theory, in questioning its ambition to and its claim to universality. So I begin with the first part of my talk, in which I explicate the debt of world literary discourses today to literary theory. And my contention here is that we need to begin to understand the current Anglo-Saxon discourse of world literature, in which the legitimization of reading and analyzing literature in and through translation plays a pivotal role as an echo of, and indeed as a late intervention in, a debate that begins in the early days of classic literary theory. By classic literary theory, I mean here the paradigm of thinking about literature that rests on the assumption that literature is a specific and unique discourse whose distinctiveness crystallizes around the abstract quality of literariness. This way of thinking about literature begins around World War I with the Russian formalists and is largely dead by the late 1980s. But classic literary theory does not disappear without leaving behind a dissipated legacy consisting in rehearsing in various ways the question of the centrality, or otherwise, of language in how we understand literature. The current debate on world literature is part and parcel of this dissipated and insecure legacy of classic literary theory, reenacting the cardinal debate on whether one should think literature within the horizon of language or beyond that horizon. It is incumbent upon us to recognize that these polemics on world literature in the Anglo-American Academy are an extension of these earlier debates on language and literariness. As is well known, the Russian formalists agreed that what lends literature its specificity is literariness. But we tend to forget that they disagreed on what constitutes literariness. Roman Jakobson believed that literariness is lodged in the intricate, fine-grained workings of language. To him, only the language of the original matters, as this intricacy cannot be captured in translation. Shklovsky, on the other hand, who, unlike Jakobson, chose to analyze throughout his career prose texts rather than poetry, and in translation, believed literariness to be portable and to be working above and beyond the level of language. It is the level of composition rather than the micro level of language that claimed Shklovsky's attention when trying to explain the effects of literariness. His famous distinction between plot and story works with undiminished validity also when we read in translation. We do not need the language of the original to appreciate the transposition of the material and its reorganization through retrospection, retardation, and other techniques. Moreover, Shklovsky and Tinyanov proved that even on the level of style, the language of the original is not the only vehicle of literariness. The parodic aspects of Don Quixote, for instance, can be gleaned and grasped also in translation, provided we have some background knowledge of chivalric culture and its conventions. Thus, the Russian formalists in turn debate on what constitutes literariness, and Shklovsky's belief in its portability beyond the language of the original had the unintended consequence of lending today ammunition and justification to those who believe in the legitimacy of reading and analyzing literature in translation. Let me repeat. The current discourse of world literature is an iteration of this principal question of classic literary theory. Should one think literature within or beyond the horizon of language. This specific iteration recasts the question while retaining its theoretical momentum. Shklovsky, who could and did work with texts of fiction in the original, would also often highlight the fact that literariness materializes on levels beyond that of the original language. In doing so, he was facing the foundational conundrum of literary theory: how to account for literariness with reference to both individual languages and language per se. If Shklovsky's response was to be seminal in terms of theory, it had to be a response that addressed both the singularity of language, the language of the original, and its multiplicity, the multiple languages in which a literary text reaches its potential audiences in translation. No claim to theory would lawfully exist unless literariness could be demonstrated to operate across languages in an act of continuous estrangement from the language of the original. The Saxon Discourse on World Literature, foremost in the work of David Brosh, has proceeded, so it seems to me, in the steps of Shklovsky, foregrounding the legitimacy of working in translation. Damrosch has implicitly confronted the tension between the singularity and multiplicity of language by concluding that studying a work of literature in the languages of its socialization is more important than studying it in the language of its production, not least because this new priority restricts and undermines the monopoly of methodological nationalism in literary studies. But the story of world literature's indebtedness to modern literary theory doesn't end there. In a workshop that I recently had the pleasure of co-organizing with Francesca Orsini, I spoke on a specific category in the modern Anglo-Saxon discourse of world literature: circulation. Allow me now to talk a little bit about circulation in order to spell out a different depth of the Anglo-Saxon discourse of world literature to classic literary theory, and in a spirit that is affirmative but also critical of this category, and that would allow me to formulate the notion of cultural zones, which will be indispensable for the second part of my talk. While evoking an image of movement and dynamics, the circularity inscribed in the notion of circulation, so central to the current Anglo-Saxon discourse of world literature, means that this movement rarely amounts to process. It only passingly and reluctantly touches upon change and transformation. It thus has ambitions comparable to the structuralist emphasis on the synchronic study of language and literature. Synchronic, of course, doesn't mean confined to the contemporary moment. It means, as in Saussure, avoiding comparisons with other temporal points which would contaminate the analysis with the presupposition of change and agency. But what if we want to conceive of world literature historically beyond this debt to structuralism and the synchronic and static frame of analysis that classic literary theory has bequeathed to world literature? And what if we want to conceive of world literature through the lens of change, dynamically rather than in the multiple but unmovable frames which circulation supplies. For that, we would need to reach for another toolkit, be it that of cultural transfer or that of interaction. Interaction seems to me the key methodological plank that would allow us to see world literature beyond the synchronic horizon, which tempts us into presentism, but dynamically in its temporal depth. In another text, I speak of world literature as the process of asymmetric and uneven interaction of the various literatures of the world, making it clear that not all literatures participate simultaneously in this process. Different literatures are part of this interaction at different times. These asymmetries and this unevenness of world literature, understood as a process of interaction that has temporal depth, are also conditioned by the fact that as they interact with one another, literatures, defined linguistically, not nationally, also interact with entire cultural zones, those of which they participate historically, and new ones that become their interlocutors at a certain point in time. In a sense, literatures do not interact entirely on their own, but always through the mediation of these larger cultural zones. The synchronic notion of circulation doesn't seem to me to be furnishing right optic here, because the idea of ready artifacts freely moving through the supply chains of the book market imagines the spaces traversed by literature as flat, leveled, and monotonous terrains, whereas in reality, their relief is rather varied. To capture the ruggedness of these landscapes, I prefer to think of world literature as existing zonally, that is, through the lives of different cultural zones. And this is, importantly, the mode of existence of world literature, not just before globalization, but also after that. Here is the example of a literature written in a small European language. From the perspective of zonality, the whole question of how Bulgarian literature enters larger literary spaces, the Byzantine, Ottoman, the Eastern European, that of Western Europe, and so on, deserves a fresh look that takes into account its integration over time into the Balkan literary zone. A literary zone is defined above all by heterogeneity, not by homogeneity, and I insist on this point. A literary zone, on my reading, is made up of languages that belong to different language families and is unwritten by the intersection of different religions and ethnicities. It's this underlying heterogeneity that propels literary zones to interaction with other zones, and the participants in this dialogue change over time. A differentiation would be in order here. I tend to insist that there is a Balkan literary zone, whereas Slavic literatures, of which Bulgarian literature is also part, are perhaps best referred to as an interliterary community, a term coined by the Slovak comparatist Dion Durishin, who stressed homogeneity as the constitutive feature of any such formation, even though Durishin's work towards the end of his life would evolve in a direction that would encompass some allowance for heterogeneity, notably in his co-edited book on the Mediterranean, which was published in Italian in Italy in 2000. With the notion of zonality in mind, interactions in which Bulgarian literature has been involved suddenly begin to lend this literature volume and balance, and this would be the case with any other literature, small or large. It is essential to realize that the cast of literatures assume the role of interlocutors, and this zonal interaction changes over time. If we look at the Caucasus, this certainly could be taken to be a prime example of a literary zone. At least three distinctive languages: Georgian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, each of them of a different linguistic filiation, two versions of Christianity, and a sizable Muslim population. Now, historically, this literary zone would interact with the Balkan literary zone, mostly through the Byzantine impact on Georgian and Armenian literatures, but also with the Indo-Persian zone, with the important presence of Persian and Sanskrit genres, conventions, motifs, etc., throughout the Caucasus. This changes in the early 19th century when Russian literature comes to the fore as a major interlocutor. And in fact, modern Azeri literature in the first half of the 20th century is very much the outcome of this new interaction, with Turkish, notably proletarian, literature still an active interlocutor in the formative decades of the 1920s, 1930s. Literary zones are not discrete formations. They often overlap, making the spaces which literature navigates as it crosses these zones even more heterogeneous. Take, for example, Eastern Europe, a conglomerate zone of Slavic, Romance, Baltic, and Finno-Ugric languages, whose major interlocutors have traditionally been the literatures created in German and French, to some extent also Russian, considerable extent, less so Scandinavian. This large zone would intersect with the Balkan one, or even with the Mediterranean zone. We thus could have literatures participating in intersecting zones with different intensity at different times. What is just as important to realize, it seems to me, is the fact that zonality as a mode of existence of world literature is not transcended or annulled with the arrival of advanced globalization since the 1970s, and especially in the last 40 years. If you are an Eastern European writer today, you would still expect the seal of approval of your work as writer and of its literary significance to come from Central Europe, mostly Germany and Austria, which have traditionally been major interlocutors for Eastern European literatures, not from America or Britain, which may bestow the market success that circulation is better suited to capture and measure. This takes me to the end of the first part of my talk, in which I was attempting to bring to the fore the debt of the current Anglo-Saxon discourse on world literature to two important premises in classic literary theory: the prioritization of translatability, and the emphasis on the synchronic study of literature and language. Let me now move to the second part of my talk, in which I wish to examine in more detail the current resistance to theory and to see what the resistance has to do with the Anglo-Saxon discourse of world literature, and how this discourse in turn positions itself differently vis-a-vis theory on this count, by emphasizing its limitations and by assisting the work of adopting a more skeptical stance vis-a-vis the claims of theory to universality. The resistance to theory that has of late been building up in the humanities, not just in literary theory, has everything to do with a global transition to a new regime of knowledge production, away from the disembodied thinking the West has privileged for several centuries. We are irresistibly involved in a move toward participatory knowledge, a regime of knowledge production in which the practical situatedness and self-interest of the participants play a very important role. We no longer seek to conceal this important role, but are instead happy to emphasize and promote it. Foregrounding the legitimacy of this new mode of cognition that is pragmatic rather than disembodied, deductive. We should also take into account here the huge presence of the new social media that have transformed our notion of truth and authority and reinforced experiential modes of inquiry that tend to be self-centered and thus have little time for norms and criteria distilled in a bindingly rational and abstract manner. When it comes specifically to literary theory, I have spent some time explicating the central reason for its demise and the resistance to its various spectral appearances since that demise in my 2019 book, The Birth and Death of Literary Theory. I argue there that the main reason why literary theory is no longer possible in the concentrated and self-sufficient form in which it was until the late 1980s is because literature itself has transitioned to a different regime of relevance. They are no longer interested in it for its specific features, that is, the autonomy, its autonomy as a discourse, but seeks instead to make various uses of it, to champion various social causes, to enter a cycle of self-therapy, or experience some entertainment. In other words, literature itself can no longer be, in this new regime of its relevance, an object of distant contemplation, supported by the erotic energy of an enduring attachment to a self-evident canon, some of it instantly available through memorization. Instead, literature becomes a means. It is once again instrumentalized, and this pragmatic stance redefines our approach to it. Remember Nietzsche or William James and the great lessons of American pragmatism. Truth cannot be argued over or distilled through disinterested procedures of contemplation or theorization, because truth is forever amalgamated with how we use things and to what ends. Literary theory sustained as it was during the 70 or so years of its existence by a notion of detachment, distance, and a capacity for analysis that is always lifted above the horizon of utility or instrumentalization, crumbled in the face of this new regime of relevance that began to privilege its public or private utility. But now I wish to make a step forward and go beyond the argument of my 2019 book in reflecting the current constellation of factors that shapes our resistance to theory. Theory as a project of Western modernity, for better or worse, has always been underwritten by a deeply held belief in the possibility of disembodied thinking. Precisely because of its disembodied nature, this thinking has held a universalizing intent, which in turn would enter into a most unholy alliance with various projects of expansion and colonization. Part of this story of disembodied and universalizing thinking that refuses to contemplate its own limitations, dictated by its cultural and social embeddedness, is, for example, Hegel's phenomenology, just as another part is the work of the Russian formalists that I mentioned earlier. The formalists genuinely believed that the material they were reflecting upon had universal significance and applicability. Thus, it didn't really occur to them to seriously test their hypothesis on samples of writing drawn from other cultural zones. Arabic literature, Chinese literature, literature in Sanskrit are very much expunged from their literary Eden. For this, they were rightly criticized by one contemporary, the budding Orientalist, at the time still a PhD student at Leningrad, Alexander Kolodovich. The young Koreanist asked the formalists in earnest how they would afford to claim universal validity for their theoretical insights, given that the material on which their analyses were based was exclusively Western, European, with a sprinkling of American literature. World literature is an important facilitator of this resistance to theory that helps us recognize the limitations of theory's claim to universality. The rise of the discourse of world literature since the start of the 21st century has brought home the truth of rather limited and conditional nature of the cultural inheritance which theory was built upon and on which it thrived. This skepticism vis-a-vis the universality of theory becomes particularly visible and very difficult to refute when we realize that actually, historically speaking, theory has not been the primary mode of reflection on literature beyond the Western tradition, however risky in its generality and open to accusations of essentialism the entire notion of a Western tradition might be. In other powerful cultural zones of non-Western formation, literature has been reflected upon primarily through the lens of poetics, not through the lens of theory. Indeed, these cultural zones have not been so enthralled by theory. In fact, what we see in these zones, and China and the Middle East would be very good examples, is that historically there has been not much demand for theory. Instead, literature has been reflected upon through the equally enabling prism of poetics, a very different prism indeed. Let me now seek to adumbrate this differentiation between theory and poetics. Literary theory derives its specificity from being the outcome of a particular historical negotiation or the place literature occupies vis-a-vis the state and its institutions, vis-a-vis religion and other important societal factors. And only in conjunction with, and sometimes in the invisible shadow of, these larger emancipatory developments, does literary theory emerge as a specific mode of reflection on literature. This negotiation, or if you prefer, emancipatory struggle, took place in the West in ways it would not occur in China or the Middle East until very recently. And when it has occurred there, the outcome has been less clear-cut and more circumspect. And this is not an evaluative statement. This is a purely descriptive argument. China and the Middle East have remained over a very long time cultural zones in which sophisticated poetics thrived. And in its impact in these cultures has endured to this day. But literary theory in the Western, including Russian understanding of it, was not a major presence. All this is just a neutral description of a historically induced difference, a significant difference, in how these cultures have related for a very long time to the place and tasks of literature in society. Indeed, for centuries on end until the last 100 or so years. Literary theory operates from the premise that literature has become an autonomous and self-sufficient discourse. It is this fundamentally new condition of literature, its autonomy, that literary theory essentially engages. Poetics operates from the premise that the literary text has always been self-sufficient, in the sense of being a self-regulated product, an artifact made according to certain inherent norms of perfection. As such, the extent to which it meets the intrinsic requirements of craftsmanship, poetics regards the text as rounded off and existing in its recurrent constitution alongside the larger spheres of politics and religion, rather than in immediate contact with or as a challenge to them. Through the lens of poetics, the text becomes a rhetorically effective means of communication or persuasion only as a byproduct of being properly crafted. Poetics thus describes literature as a body of writing that has never been dynamically involved in directly interacting with or crucially imposing the state and its institutions, religion and its infrastructure, and so on. Let me illustrate this with a comparison. In Plato's famous Republic, especially Book 10, the poet, as we would all recall, is declared potentially dangerous, and his expulsion from the polis is considered not inappropriate. Very early on, this shapes the relationship between literature and the state, literature and politics. Ultimately, literature and the polis and its collective causes, be they moral, political, much later draped as national. And this relationship is shaped as profoundly antagonistic. Sophocles' Antigone could serve here as a classic example. This antagonism resurfaces throughout the history of Western writing as one of its defining themes. Compare this with Confucius' understanding of the place of literature in society and vis-a-vis the state. In the Analects, chronologically, roughly the same time as Plato's Republic, Confucius says in the Untitled Chapter, I quote, "The odes serve to stimulate the mind." Sometimes the odes is translated simply as poems. So the odes serve to stimulate the mind. They may be used for purposes of self-contemplation. They teach the art of sociability. They show how to regulate feelings of resentment. From them, you learn the more immediate duty of serving one's father and the remoter one of serving one's prince. End of quote. The difference couldn't be more striking. Poetry is a means of managing grievance. It is also a means of asserting authority in the household and in the state. It is meant to be integrated into the state rather than abide in a relationship of antagonism to it. In China, this concatenation of poetry and the state was institutionalized through the civil service examination system, of which classical poetry became a part in the 7th century AD and remained so until 1905. The purpose of this system was not to question tradition, let alone instill a sense of autonomy, but to perpetuate the state by reproducing the right skills of governance and of poetry making according to the canons of classical poetics. Thus, imagination and originality, the fountains of revolt against this subservient of literature, and very much the building blocks of the idea of autonomy that came to the fore with European Romanticism, were not seen as must-have qualities in China. Whereas Shakespeare was to be refashioned and celebrated by the Romantics as the epitome of irregularity, wildness, creativity, and invention, not as the serial stealer and recycler of plots he often was, in China, even after the transition to writing in modern Chinese, with the first poem in modern Chinese appearing in 1917, as late as that, the fetishization of classical poetry and its poetics, with its pleasing and binding patterns of regularity, would linger on for a very long time to come, practically to the current moment. And there is literature by sinologists that describe this phenomenon. In Western Europe, on the contrary, there are longer or shorter ways of following the recipes of classical poetics, but the imitation drive largely expires by the end of the 17th century, or early in the 18th century. Just as important, it seems to me, is the fundamentally different way in literature positions itself, not just vis-a-vis state, but also vis-a-vis religion. In the Middle East, the reign of poetics over theory has everything to do with the important consensus which Arabists have written about, the consensus that the message of the Quran not be varied in terms of content. This message, the message of the Quran, can only be rendered in poetically varying ways that make individual innovation and originality recognizable solely when projected onto the screen of tradition, with its established genres, metrics, stock imagery, rhetorical and compositional devices, and so on. In China, too, literature historically did not find itself in the situation of having to claim its own territory by pushing against religion in what would, in the West, gradually constitute an act of secularization, with all the due and very important impact the Judeo-Christian inheritance would continue to exercise. In China, religion was structured in ways that would preclude such a dramatic pushback on the part of literature. There was, in a sense, little to push back against. No scripture as such, and no church that would guard over the purity of that scripture. The canons of the three major doctrines, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, did not crystallize down to a single scripture, and they were guarded not by a church, but by the state, which would sometimes see it fit to destroy them. What is more, the underlying distinction between orthodox and heterodox is far less clear-cut and begins to assume sharper contours only with the arrival of Buddhism. In classical or pre-modern China, there are no words equivalent to the words religion. The latter is a late borrowing from Japanese, or no equivalence for the words theology, or as Dadbridge has indicated in a classic study of Chinese, of religion in China, not even a word that would correspond to the word priest. Consider also this, and Martin Kern, amongst others, have written persuasively on this. Very early on, the canon of Confucianism included Chinese poetry. And Confucius was even believed by many, I believe disproved by now, to have compiled and edited that part of the canon, so-called classic of poetry. We thus see that genetically and typologically, literary theory is a Western product, a realization that the discourse of world literature has assisted us in reaching. And it would not do justice to either the Chinese or the Middle Eastern cultural zones, and for various reasons, one could also include here the vast realms of Persia and the Indian subcontinent, which were often conjoined in the past, if we were to miss the fact that reflecting on literature there was not necessarily taking place through the prism of theory. Those of us in the West who worked with Chinese scholars sometimes find ourselves impatiently awaiting their release of a Chinese literary theory. I have myself had such conversations with Chinese colleagues. The reaction would be unfailingly polite, but not without a hint at the superfluity or even harmfulness of such attempts. Attempting to produce a literary theory from a Chinese perspective, runs the risk of having to accept the discursive rules of the West, giving up the belief in China being different, read independent of the West. And with that, also the entire Western disposition of looking at literature through the prism of various constitutive antagonisms, sometimes latent, sometimes explicit. Not forcing on China or the Middle East our expectations that they should come up with a Chinese or Middle Eastern literary theory would be a good start on the long journey towards recognizing their specific historical and discursive constellations and their unique cultural resources. As a European, and I come here to my conclusion, as a European or Western project, theory today can only function under the sign of erasure and an epistemic humility in the face of the radically different cultural landscape that has thrust the West into the uncertain zone of no longer binding values and discursive rules, a realization that the discourse of world literature has enabled in many ways. World theory is not on the agenda. The parts left over after the breakdown of theory, that previously reliable machine for producing globally valid truths and universally applicable interpretative tools, cannot be reassembled into a meaningful aggregate. No longer in dominant position, theory can lead today and tomorrow an intrepid partisan existence in Carl Schmitt's understanding of the partisan, mobilized and relied upon to sabotage over and over again in numerous acts of local valor the deleterious condition of post-truth and elective isolationism. Theory can indeed be the saboteur par excellence, working from within the currently prevalent discourses of particularization. It is capable of reawakening a sense of communality, ever so tentative, no longer lasting, in what is becoming an age of impending secondary fragmentation. Thank you. I feel I should stop here so that we can start the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much for such a rich and fascinating paper, Galin. I can see a hand is raised already, and I'm going to just briefly invite people to do the same if they have a question. You can also post in the chat. I'm conscious to give Galin a break to have a sip of water or tea. But yeah, perhaps we can just jump in. I mean, I have some questions myself, but given there's a hand raised, perhaps we can just jump into the discussion. Kitty Helmet, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, yes, thank you. This has been really helpful for me. I'm studying comparative literature at Oxford, but I don't come from a literary theory background, and so it's been huge to hear the bird's eye view of how the field has developed, and thank you for that. My focus is particularly on African literature, and so I wondered if there might be an equivalent to this lens of poetics that you've identified in the East, and how I might go about investigating it further.
Thank you. This is a wonderful question, and I have to admit that I know little about African literatures, very little, and indeed my knowledge of Chinese and Middle Eastern is entirely based on reading as widely as possible in Western languages and in Russian, and trying to develop a sense of what would be a safe consensus zone, so that my facts are right, and so that the risk extends solely to how these facts are interpreted. But with reference to African literature, my take on this is that African literatures are probably uniquely positioned today to question this entire theoretical discourse in a crucial and very powerful way, because theory as a discourse derives its consensus from the valorization of the written word. Theory is impossible without a canon from which it draws all these examples that claim universality. And if you look at literary theory from World War I into the 1980s, it essentially revolves around highlighting various works of the Western and the Russian canon for the purposes of formulating different approaches to literature and to the text. Whereas African literature teaches us this great lesson that you cannot do this without taking into account the intermedial existence of literature. Because what is an account of a literary text worth if it assumes that it is always already ready-made, formed completely, accomplished, traveling just as an artifact and a commodity of the book market? This would crumble in the face of what you would find in Africa, where literature really moves between orality and written enactment, and then back into orality and ritual. I mean, the Russian formalists did have some notion of secondary orality, and they were not the only ones. There is somebody theorizing that talks about, for example, skaz as an orientation within the literary text that is meant or aims to reproduce a sense of secondary orality. But this is not enough, because African forces or African literatures force us to realize that today you cannot really begin to conceptualize literature without the frame of intermediality and without this constant shuffling between orality, script, secondary orality, and ritual. There is a wonderful article that I'm aware of that explores some of these questions with reference to Swahili in East Africa. And it is in a volume on comparative world literatures that Dieter Lamping and I edited in 2019. It is in English by a German Africanist. And I'm sure there is other work in this direction. So this very brief would be my answer. African literatures, from where I stand, they're not just about nuancing a literary theory, they are about a very principled and profound interrogation of its premises, of looking at the text as fixed, as formed. Yeah. I know what you think. Well, we can continue this now or afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Colin. Thank you for your question, Kitty. I can see that there are plenty of activity going on in the chat. Kitty, suggestions suggestions of where you might look specifically on the question of African literature. So that's very useful indeed. Thank you. I'll invite people to again raise their hands, post in the chat. Galen, lots of thanks in the chat for such a wonderful talk. I mean, can I ask a quick question, in perhaps while people kind of come up with the questions themselves, Galen? I'm conscious you're talking about I suppose a particular kind of theory, but I wonder, could you comment a bit more on what is described as theories of world literature? And I mean, you spoke about the discourse of world literature. I just wondered whether you wanted to differentiate between those two things, and yeah, and I suppose thinking about where we are in terms of that at the moment.
Thank you, Joe. That's an interesting question, and I should probably engage in a proper discussion here, and maybe ask what is meant by theories of world literature, and what is the stake in seeking to differentiate between discourse and theory of world literature.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I need to think about myself. I mean, maybe I'm just kind of in a very kind of prosaic way, just naming this kind of theories of world literature, and rather perhaps we should be thinking it in terms of discourse. Would that be?
I don't know. I suppose my paper today is driven by this sense that I have that world literature, when it began as a discourse in its modern version, not the Goethe-esque version, early in the 21st century, it did so perhaps on premises that we can recognize as liberal. And I think this is very important. And what do I mean by this when I call these premises liberal? I mean that it is built on the assumption that there is competition over cultural capital, and this, of course, over a line that Casanova took in the 1990s. So there is competition over cultural capital, visibility, and prestige. And this competition is somehow, if not fair, certainly resolvable with artistic and literary means. The better writer wins the competition. It is also liberal in the sense not just of recognizing and mimicking competition, but also in the sense of being built on this liberal premise that literature exists by functioning as a reservoir of meanings that can never be depleted. Yeah, the meanings literature produces keep growing. And the idea of circulation was initially attached to this notion of meanings that have to multiply. The trouble there, of course, is that a circulation doesn't sit very well with the idea of decontextualization, which occurs in this movement of artifacts and of commodities through the veins of the book market. So liberal discourses, they have the great advantage of actually of probably making a little bit more easily a claim to universality, because their premises seem to be natural. Of course, they're anything but. So in that regard, I would agree with you that some methodological skepticism or the work of some sober suspicion is in order here. Whether we would call this a theory of world literature, I don't know. Probably I would think of this as a methodology of world literature, and methodology broadly conceived, not the technique, but the examination of the premises. Because theory takes me personally always back to this assumption that cognition is somehow disembodied and somehow independent of its players and users and its context. And the whole tenor of my talk is actually to question that. Yeah. So yes, but there are different methodologies of world literature. Of course, there is a sea of difference between this liberal discourse, which has its own virtues and its own merits, and the work that comes out of scholars who embrace world systems theory, for example, which has its own strengths and its own limitations. So there is a genuine plurality there, and I suppose we can have an entire workshop around this, and I'm sure I'm only scratching the surface now in response to this important question.
Thank you very much, Galen. That's very useful indeed. So a question has come into me. I suppose it's slightly related to what I just asked, so I'll read it out. It's someone who doesn't have a microphone. It's not in the chat. It's Ali, sent it directly to me, but he says he hasn't got a microphone, but he was wondering if, Galen, you could comment on the relationship between world literature and comparative literature. And the question is, does the latter privilege theory, or do we have a space for poetics there? And would poetics allow us to engage with literature in the world? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have to say that various chunks of what I presented here have either just been published or will be published in May in a journal called Differences from Duke University Press. And there will be more on this differentiation between theory and poetics. But as it happens, a month or so ago, I was giving a lecture precisely on the relationship between world literature and comparative literature for the High School of Economics in St. Petersburg in English. But that lecture was historically oriented. And there, I was actually trying to challenge this myth that world literature is somehow a new discourse that appears early in the 21st century, especially with this very seminal book, What is World Literature, by Damrosch. The truth of the matter is, world literature precedes the discourse of comparative literature by a margin. And well before comparative literature is coined as a term in 1817 in France, there is a discourse of world literature that precedes Goethe's by about 50 years. And if you look at William Jones and his discovery of the value of Sanskrit, which causes this fervent effort by everybody who is somebody to master Sanskrit. Friedrich Schlegel is in Paris at the time, hires a private tutor to study Sanskrit. And if you look at body of writing at that time, in the second half of the 18th century, you would see that the horizon that goes beyond Europe in a manner that would evolve what I call other cultural zones, that horizon is already there. But what happens historically, and I spoke about this in my lecture, is that throughout the 19th century, and particularly beginning at the mid-19th century, the world literature discourse retreats, and comparative literature gradually gains the upper hand for reasons that are political, historical, institutional, and largely have to do with the 19th century being the long century of cultural and political nationalism. And comparative literature begins life not in an innocent manner. It begins life as a tool of looking at your neighbors and asserting your identity as unique, sometimes actually superior to your neighbor. This is why comparative literature moves within a very narrow triangle initially of neighbors. What do the English know of Rousseau? Or why are the French neglecting German romanticism? And this supremacy of comparative literature is consolidated later in the 19th century when the first departments begin to emerge. There is no department, there is no chair of world literature throughout the 19th century, and indeed throughout the 20th century, not as such. And the other myth under which we've been laboring is that somehow world literature and comparative literature, and I come here to the question of poetics, in a sense, have been irreconcilably opposed in how they see translation, with comparative literature working through this sanctified lens of the original, and world literature taking the liberty to think and write about literature through translation. Of course, nothing can be further from the truth, because the classic early body of comparative literature for many decades is a body of scholarship that is steeped in reception studies, which very much draw on translation and the importance of translation and on translated texts and their readers. So this edge that we all remember, that the birth of this modern discourse of world literature and its seemingly sudden rise early in the 21st century was accompanied with this very severe polemic between world literature scholars and their counterparts in comparative literature. Actually, there is a lot of shared territory there. And actually, poetics, as I was trying to show, in the early days of literary theory, shares a lot of common ground with theory, precisely because people like Shklovsky did not believe that the effects of literariness are limited to what the language of the original can produce. Notably, some of the very early works of the Russian formalists would be published in a miscellany in 1919 in Petrograd that carried the title Poetics. In 1925, the first, if you allow me this expression text-like articulation of literary theory in Russia by Tomaszewski seemingly would build on this early overlap between theory and poetics. It the title a literary theory colon poetics. I tried in the paper to touch upon this shared ground, this notion of autonomy and self-sufficiency of a text. But theory parts company with poetics. It realizes that this is a product, a historical product, and not an inherent feature of the text. So to conclude then, in a sense, I don't think that the opposition between world literature and comparative literature should be so rigid. And I don't think that either of these is either better or worse equipped to draw on the analytical benefits that poetics has to offer. Of course, world literature is taking a turn before our very eyes towards distant reading in all sorts of ways, not just in Moretti's way, but in other ways too. How this sits with poetics, whether this is compatible with poetics, I think the skepticism there would be well justified.
Thank you very much, Galin. We've got two questions in the chat, and I just wanted to invite, if I may, Joanna. We have a question here about what the age of impending secondary fragmentation will look like. I wondered, Joanna, if you wanted to come on and ask a question, or if you prefer me to read it. No, I mean, perhaps you can respond, Galin, and then if Joanna wants to come back, she can. Oh, her mic doesn't work, unfortunately. So yeah, the question is, she's wondering whether you could share your thoughts on what the age of impending secondary fragmentation will look like.
Okay, very briefly. This is embedded in my talk in a part which I had to skip, which talked about COVID and where we are with this discourse of world literature in the current moment. And there are two considerations here. One is this phenomenon that we all witness, rowing back against globalization. And the opponents of globalization actually occupy various spots in the political spectrum. Some attack globalization from the right, others from the left. But this skeptical stance is becoming more and more visible. And I think that what I call secondary fragmentation is occurring in the wake of this uncertainty and hesitation vis-a-vis globalization. And it is also, I think, occurring in a sense because of the radically changed geopolitics of the world that is emerging now, where we increasingly witness this imperative to focus on the tasks at hand here and now in our own societies, which will have to navigate their way out of the crisis and what will quite likely be its very prolonged aftermath. And this is not just a question of Brexit. This is a question that in various ways affects I think Europe as a whole, its position in the world, but also the growing sense that there is no single center of power. There is not even a bipolar world any longer. There are instead different macro regions with their history, with their conflicts, with their human and technological and economic resources and potential that will be seeking to shore up their, first of all, security, and from then on, their potential to exercise impact on a larger scale. This, of course, has also technological dimension. I happen to believe that this world, this magic world of technology that brings us together so easily, also separates us because we are now increasingly trapped in our own social media communities, which increasingly become incommensurable in their beliefs and tastes and in their own truths. And I find this worth worrying about, or at least worth thinking about. Yeah. But others have written about this more eloquently, about technology and compartmentalization and driving us into our own niche community positions.
Thank you very much, Galen. So I'm just conscious of the time, but we do perhaps have time for one more question. And Andy has written to me in the chat. And Andy Mosley, do you want to ask your question? I can hear you, Andy. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that really interesting talk. I mean, I suppose it follows on from what you've just been saying in a way. You used words like embeddedness and embodiment and particularity as a way of countering the universality of literary theory, or presumed universality of literary theory. But then at the end, you use the word fragmentation, which I suppose is the downside of words like embeddedness and embodiment, and you've elaborated on that just now. So given fragmentation, how important still is the role of literary theory, or would you want to kind of demolish it entirely?
No, I think I ended up on a constructive note by saying that there is a role for theory, but not in the monolithic and slightly totalitarian way in which it has been performing its intellectual duties so far, but rather in this energizing but also very provisional, very local sabotaging of claims to universality. So the role of a partisan who performs irregular resistance rather than the resistance that comes with donning a uniform and taking one's orders from a universal rule book. Yeah? So I'm not entirely at all dismissive of theory. I just want to say that I don't believe that theory has or can be reconstituted in its previous position as a universal edifice. It has a different function today, I think, and a different scope of intervention.
Thank you.
Well, Galen, I'm very grateful that you've stuck with us all the way through the questions and comments, and I'm very conscious that the time we're nearing the end of our time together. That there is one comment in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to pick up on this, which I wanted to put to you just finally, and that was the last comment there about the question of the Middle East, and a question about, are you talking about these very is there a danger of lumping together these very different contexts in the label of the Middle East?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I don't talk about African here, but I do talk about Persian and Arabic, and advisedly so, because in a sense, the preponderance of poetics here is something they share, they do have in common, just as they share the way they traditionally position themselves vis-a-vis religion, and just as they share the largely and enduringly, well into mid-20th century, suppressed notion of originality, which also means a very different understanding of what a translation is allowed to do. Both Arabic and Persian literatures, and this is a well-studied phenomenon, have literary genres which are totally legitimate and which flourish between the 12th and the 18th century, in some cases also later than that, genres that consist of nothing else but a conversation with a preceding, earlier canonical literary text. And from a European perspective, it is very difficult to actually locate such works. Do they represent a translation? Do they represent an annihilation, an adaptation, a dialogue? The truth is that with our own toolkit that looks at the text as fully formed, and that insists since the 18th century at least on originality and uniqueness and novelty, we simply cannot grasp such genres. But of course there are differences. And of course, if someone undertakes to write a book about all this, it will have to be done on the basis of treading very carefully and accounting for these differences as much as possible. But there will be differences even if you were to take Persian only, not Persian and Arabic, because Persian exists in different iterations. Persian behaves differently once it ceases to be the language of the educated elites or a court language. In the 20th century, outside Iran proper, Persian has a very different existence. If you look at Tajikistan and the formation of Tajik literature, you would immediately realize that. So I agree with the subtext of your question, and I just want to find a way of seeing the woods without felling the trees.
Thank you very much, Galen. And I think that's a nice place for us to end today. I've posted a link in the chat to further events in the series, so you can click on that and see what's coming up. we tend to hold a seminar about once every month. Galen, just to say thank you very much indeed for such a rich paper and such a brilliant response, and thank you for sticking with us with the questions and responding to those comments as well. And thank you to everyone who came today and asked questions and participated in the discussion. That's really, really brilliant discussion, and I think lots of food for thought, certainly for me. So thank you very much, Galen. And we're looking forward to seeing many of you at the next seminar. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much to all of you for coming and for very good questions, which mean I will continue thinking about this. And many thanks to Joe for moderating this. Thank you.
Thank you, Galen. Bye, everybody.